Hello everybody, I hope you're all doing well. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can improve your images by using exposure bracketing. So, have you ever gone outside just to see a beautiful sunset right in front of your eyes, and then take out your cell phone or your point and shoot camera and take an image of it? But this is what you get. It's not exactly what you had in mind, and that is because the scene you are trying to photograph has a lot of dynamic range, which means the highlights is very bright compared to the shadows in the scene. And the difference between the highlights and the shadows is large, and the scene has a lot of contrast. So cameras struggle with maintaining detail in the highlights or the shadows of an image. So when you see you have a sky that is purely white and blown out, you try to decrease the exposure, and this is what you get. The sky is now quite beautiful, but the shadows and the land area of your image is just pure black. And when you try to expose the shadows correctly by raising the exposure again, the highlights just goes to white again and just blows out. So this is the problem with cameras. So where the problem comes in is cameras in general, but especially cameras with smaller sensors like the ones inside of smartphones and drones and point and shoot cameras. Those sensors doesn't have a lot of dynamic range, and that means that the camera finds it very hard to maintain detail in the absolute highlights and the absolute shadows of a scene, and in one image, because more than one image can be taken at different exposures, and then there can be detail in the shadows and the highlights, but the trick is to get it in one image, and that is where the smaller sensors and the older sensors struggle. So we don't use exposure bracketing to create the HDR effect that I'm personally not a big fan of, like those scenes that the sky is actually very dark and the shadows very bright. That's not what we're trying to do with exposure bracketing. Exposure bracketing is used just to recreate or reproduce the dynamic range of the human eye. And the second thing you have to know is that exposure bracketing can not be used for moving subjects or moving camera. Your camera should be stationary and your subject also. So what is exposure bracketing? First of all, I just want to say that exposure bracketing might sound a bit intimidating at first, but it's actually very easy to do, and it's not a hard technique. And the good thing is every camera can do it, so you won't have a problem doing it with your camera. Exposure bracketing is taking multiple images of slightly different exposures, with some slightly overexposed, some very overexposed, some correctly exposed, some underexposed, and some very underexposed. And this is to cover the dynamic range of the scene you are trying to photograph. There are two reasons that I can think of that someone would want to use exposure bracketing, with the first being if you're not sure what the correct exposure for a scene should be, just take multiple images of slightly different exposures, and then you can select the correct exposure or the exposure you want afterwards. But the big reason, and this is also why I made this video, is to get more dynamic range out of your camera and to, as I said, recreate the dynamic range of the human eye. You will hear the words dynamic range a lot in this video, and that is because the whole reason we are using exposure bracketing is to gain dynamic range in our cameras. So let me show you how. I'm going to first show you how with a drone, and then I'm going to show you how to do it with a DSLR. So let's get into it. So I'm standing in my room with my drone facing out the window, recreating a high dynamic range scene, with the outside being very bright compared to the inside of the room. So first of all, I'm going to switch to photo mode. and I'm going to show you how to do it in automatic mode, which is the mode I'm in right now, and in manual mode. So first of all, we want to take a very dark exposure and to let the highlights, the absolute highlights, perfectly exposed. So I'm going to tap on the brightest part of the scene, which is the left window. As you can see, it darkened the whole exposure, but it's still not dark enough. I want to see a little more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the right bottom corner, and as you can see, there is an EV, or an exposure compensation exposure value button. I'm going to press on that and decrease my exposure even more. I would say one stop underexposed is perfect. So from now on, I want to take the images as quick as possible, but I'm not going to rush it because I know my drone is stationary and there's no wind blowing it around, and it's a tutorial, so I'm showing you how to do it. So first of all, I'm going to take my first image. Then I'm going to select just a normal exposure value. As you can see, I have the highlights covered now with very dark images. So now I want to press on something little darker, but still a highlight. So as you can see, I pressed on the tree on the left right window, and I'm going to take a picture there. It looks a little overexposed still, so I'm going to drop that also. Maybe, there we go. Take another image, then reset that. Then I'm going to, we have the highlights covered now, and as you can see, there's no midtones in this image. It's only absolute highlights and absolute shadows. So if there is midtones in your image that isn't so bright but isn't very dark, you will press on that and let it expose for the midtones. So I'm going to straight to the shadows now to get that covered. So as you can see, I'm going to press on the shadows, which is the darkest part of the image. As you can see, it brightens up, but not a lot. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to increase the exposure now with the exposure value to somewhere around 1 stop. Take another image and then even more. 2 stops and maybe 3 stops even, to cover the absolute shadows. So now I have the exposure bracketed images taken with automatic mode. And you might notice that there is no ISO setting, and that is the problem with automatic mode. It's quick, but you might get unwanted noise, and so that is when I'm going to go to the manual mode. So here I am. As you can see, it displays ISO, shutter speed, and then the exposure compensation at the right. If you don't fully understand the settings that's on the screen right now, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, please go check out my other video on camera basics. I'm going to link it up here if you don't understand that and want to learn more about those settings. So as you can see, I have no aperture control, so that is fixed on this drone, which is fixed at 2.8. Then I'm going to go to ISO. That is the setting I always want as low as possible for the best image quality and dynamic range, and that is really what we want. So I'm going to select 100, that is the desired value. Then we only have one element of the exposure triangle left to control the exposure, so that is shutter speed. So I'm going to tap on shutter speed, and I'm going to do the same that I did with automatic. First, exposing for the highlights. So I'm going to increase my shutter speed to decrease the exposure. I think that is the appropriate exposure for the brightest part of the image. Take that one. Then maybe a little brighter. There we go. Maybe brighter. I think that's appropriate. Brighter. You can take as many as you want to make sure you cover every stop or the whole range. And there we go. Now I captured a whole range of different exposed images in automatic and manual mode. I prefer manual mode because I can set the ISO to 100, so I'm sure it doesn't increase the noise or decrease the dynamic range without any need to. And now I'm going to show you how to do it with the DSLR. If you understand what to do now, you can skip to straight to the editing, where I'm going to show you how to process these images and to get the final result. So here I am with my DSLR now facing out the window, recreating a high dynamic range scene like before. So first of all, just remember always to switch your lens or your camera from autofocus to manual focus to prevent it from focusing between shots, or just use back button focus. So I'm in manual mode. Let's start off with a normal or an average exposure. I'm going to look on my meter here and I can see it centered, so that would be a normal exposure. Okay, now I'm going to increase my exposure to expose a little more for the highlights, which means the exposure should drop, and it did. And increase that even more. Take another shot, and I think I'm going to increase it maybe once more. That would cover the whole range of the highlights. And now I'm going to go back to the normal exposure and decrease it a little bit. Take an image like that. As you can see, the shadows is starting, everything is starting to brighten up, but the details in the shadows is coming up. My shutter speed is getting slow, but that's fine. I'm on a tripod, and I think I'm going to go even slower. So I did that to prevent my hand from shaking the camera, just leaving the shutter button. So I put the self timer on. At slower shutter speeds, I do this normally. You can use a remote or just the self timer, and it gives the camera a chance to stop vibrating or stop moving from your hand leaving the shutter button or pushing the shutter button, and you can get steady shots at lower shutter speeds. So that is how the process of taking bracketing images with a DSLR. I'm here in Lightroom now. I imported the images from my Mavic Mini and from the Nikon DSLR. And let me show you how you can change a bunch of images of different exposures or a sequence of images into one image with high dynamic range. So I'm in the library tab in Lightroom, but we don't want to be here. We want to be in the develop tab. So I'm going to click on the develop word on top, the top menu. Then as you can see, I have all my Mavic Mini files on the left. I have the letters DJI in the file name, and then I have my Nikon files at the right. So first of all, we want to select all of our Mavic Mini files that we are going to work with to create the HDR. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the first file. It's already selected, and then I'm going to hold shift and click on the last one. That will select all of the images between the two selected ones, which means every image we want to work with. So I'm going to right click on the selected images. I'm going to go up to photo merge and select HDR. That stands for high dynamic range. As you can see, a window popped up and it's busy creating the HDR preview. This will render. I can see It might take a while if you have a slow computer or an old computer like this one. It might take very long depending on how much files you have also. So the settings auto align, that will auto align the images so that there's no weird overlapping and weird misalignments in the sequence of images. That's very useful, especially for a drone that has a gimbal and it's not stationary in the air. It moves a bit, especially if it's a windy day. So that I always select that. It cannot harm your image. It can only make your image better. Then auto settings, I leave that off because I want to edit the final image as I like. Then the deghost is if something moves in the frame, like maybe your drone moved a bit, it was a windy day, maybe select that on low, or when there's maybe a tree and you're close to the tree and the tree moved a lot in the wind, medium might be a good setting. And maybe someone walked into your image on in one of the images and you didn't realize, high might be a good setting. But you must experiment with that and see what works for you. Create stack, I don't know what that is, but I always leave it off, and the results are wonderful when I use the setting. So I'm going to come back to you when this is finished rendering. Lightroom is now finished rendering the preview, and now I'm going to the bottom right and just click on merge, and Lightroom would now add it to the tasks. You will see a bar on top appear, and this will show that, there we go, that Lightroom is now finalizing the HDR file. So this might also take a while. This may take a while on this computer also. So I'm going to leave you and get back to you when it's done finalizing the final file. Lightroom is now finished finalizing the final HDR file. So you will see all of the original files are still selected, but we don't want to work with them. We want to work with the HDR file with the high dynamic range. And you'll find that file just after the selected files. There's a file and it has the letters HDR in the file name. That is the file we want to work with. So we're going to select it by single clicking on the file. We will let it load, and I will show you that it might not look like much right from the beginning, and it might not look like we've gained any dynamic range at all, but the magic comes in, and the real proof comes in when I decrease the highlights and increase the shadows, and you will see the real magic happening. So the image is a little dark. The highlights is darker than I want, than I need, and the shadows is also too dark. So a little trick is I'm going to raise the exposure until the shadows is, I think that is a pretty good final exposure. And you will see I have detail in the highlights, I have detail in the shadows, and I have the whole range right here to work with in this file. So let me compare it to one of the single images. So this is I will choose one in the middle. So this one would be a representation of a file that if you only had to take one image, this is the exposure you would have chosen to take the image at. And as you can see straight away, the highlights is fully blown out. There's no detail. I decreased the highlights all the way. There's no detail there, only pure white, so no detail. That's blown out. Shadows, there's shadow detail in this image. Let me lift that shadows, and we will compare the noise between the two. So I think this one, we have to get them at the same exposure as well, otherwise we can't compare noise. So let's zoom in on this one. As you can see, very noisy, a lot of dots or grain on the image, and it's not that sharp. So let's switch to the HDR file we created. That would be this one, and let's compare it with this one. So I will let it load. Here I am zoomed into the HDR file. As you can see, very clean, very few noise, very little noise, very little grain, pretty sharp. Everything looks great. So that is what an HDR can do to an HDR procedure or process can do to your images. And let me show you the Nikon image, and let me show you the dynamic range I could get out of him. So here's a tip. If your camera is able to shoot RAW, always shoot RAW, because that might be the reason in the first place that you need to do a bracketed shot, because you're not using RAW. But RAW allows you to have way more detail and color range and dynamic range in your final file. So always use RAW when shooting high dynamic range scenes, and especially when you're doing a bracketed shot, because that will help you increase your dynamic range even more, even if you're already doing a bracket. So as you can see, a lot of dynamic range in this file. Also, I used these files, all the Nikon files, with the same process. Select all of them by clicking the first one, holding shift, clicking the last one, right click, photo merge, HDR, letting the preview render, and select merge. And this is the final file. As you can see, I already edited it to get the most dynamic range, and as you can see, a lot of dynamic range in this file also. So that is how exposure bracketing can be used to increase the dynamic range in your images, especially if you're using a cell phone or a drone or something with a smaller or older sensor. This will help you a lot, and this will help you improve your overall images and photography. And if you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe if you like my videos. And I have a lot of them coming, so if you like them, please subscribe and share them to someone who you might think might use this. And thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.